darkness, a breath, a chain rattles. Once there was a man whose power terrified kings, a man whose hands could tear lions apart, yet could not master his own heart. His name was whispered across the deserts of Canaan, a name that burned in both fear and reverence. Samson, the chosen warrior of God, a weapon forged in heaven and broken by desire. But what if the story we know is only a fragment of a much deeper mystery? What if Samson's fall was never just a tragedy, but a coded revelation buried within Scripture for those who dare to look closer? The chains tighten, the darkness breathes, and the story begins. The land groaned beneath the weight of silence. 40 years, a generation born and buried under the iron fist of the Philistines. Their chariots thundered through the valleys of Canaan, their gods carved into every gate, every altar. Israel's fields yielded harvests that no longer belonged to them. Their prayers rose to heaven, but seemed to return as echoes of despair. Once they were a chosen people, now they were slaves of their own fear. The covenant had grown cold. Idols stood where faith once burned. Men bartered loyalty for survival. Women wept in secret, teaching their children to whisper the name of Yahweh as though it were forbidden. And yet, in the stillness of oppression, heaven was not silent. When the last ember of faith seemed ready to die, a divine spark was struck. It began in obscurity in a nameless village among the hills of Dan. A woman barren forgotten went about her daily labor when the air changed. The wind ceased. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. And then light. Not the light of sun or fire, but of eternity breaking through the veil of the mortal world. Before her stood an angel of the Lord, radiant beyond comprehension, terrifying yet beautiful, clothed in the brilliance of divine authority. His voice was both thunder and whisper, "You will conceive and bear a son. No wine shall touch your lips, no razor shall ever come upon his head, for the child shall be consecrated to God from the womb. Through him, Israel shall begin to be delivered from the hand of the Philistines." Her hands trembled, her heart pounded like war drums in the distance. For years she had known emptiness, and now she bore the weight of prophecy. The promise was not just a child, it was redemption wrapped in flesh. When Manoah, her husband, heard her words, disbelief seized him. He prayed, desperate, uncertain that the messenger might return, and heaven answered. Once more the angel appeared standing amidst the smoke of sacrifice, and as Manoah fell upon his face, the messenger ascended in flame, a living fire rising toward the heavens. Manoah cried out, "We have seen God," but his wife, steady in faith, whispered, "If the Lord intended to destroy us, he would not have shown us these things." From that day forward, their home became a sanctuary. The barren woman's body stirred with life. Each heartbeat within her was a promise fulfilled, a reminder that God's deliverance often begins in obscurity, not in palaces but in pain. When the child was born, they named him Samson Shimshon the sun, and it was as though dawn itself rose over Israel. He was no ordinary infant. Even in his laughter there was something unearthly, a quiet strength, a presence that unsettled darkness. But heaven's gifts are never without danger. For every light casts a shadow, and from the moment Samson drew breath, the enemy began to stir. The Philistines sensed a change, a tremor in the unseen. Their priests spoke of an omen, a child destined to undo their dominion. And so began the invisible war between divine promise and demonic resistance, between covenant and corruption. Even as the infant grew, unseen eyes watched. Whispers spread in Philistine temples, "The deliverer has been born." They laughed, but fear lingered behind their smiles. For they remembered the God of Israel, the one who had split seas and shattered empires. And though his people had forgotten him, he had not forgotten them. In a world ruled by iron and idols, a child of light had entered the battlefield. The storm had begun to turn, and soon the fire of deliverance would no longer be contained. But with every gift of heaven comes a price. And the boy called Samson would learn that the greater the calling, the greater the cost. The boy of promise became a man of legend. Samson, the name once spoken in whispers, now thundered across the land. He was unstoppable, unshakable, untamed. His body was a fortress of muscle, his hands weapons of divine power. When he walked, the earth itself seemed to bow beneath his steps. In one breath, he tore a lion apart with his bare hands, leaving its carcass on the roadside. Days later, when he passed that same place, he found bees nesting in the lion's body, honey dripping from death itself. He scooped it into his hands and ate, smiling. A strange image of prophecy, sweetness born from decay, victory rising from sin. But even then he broke his vow, touching the corpse, the unclean. The first crack in the armor had appeared. Israel sang his name. The Philistines trembled, but pride whispered louder than any enemy. And Samson began to listen. He no longer sought the voice of heaven. He followed the voice within. Strength had blinded him long before the blade ever would. He laughed at warnings, mocked restraint, and called it freedom. Yet the ancient words still echoed in the unseen. He who exalts himself shall be humbled. Then came a woman, a Philistine, beautiful, forbidden, and dangerous. His parents begged him to turn away, but Samson's heart was a wildfire, and the fire refused to listen to reason. He desired her, though she belonged to a people who worshipped other gods, gods of iron, blood, and lust. Still, he pursued her, claiming, "She pleases me. She is right in my eyes." Those words, "right in my eyes," would become the echo of his downfall. At the wedding feast, laughter filled the air. Riddles were told, wine flowed like rivers, and then deceit. The woman he loved betrayed his secret to her people. Rage surged through Samson like divine fire turned dark. He stormed out, and when he returned, vengeance was the only language he spoke. In one of the most terrifying acts ever recorded, Samson captured 300 foxes, tied torches to their tails, and released them through Philistine grain fields. The fire spread like judgment itself, devouring vineyards, olive groves, everything in its path. The night sky glowed crimson, not with glory, but with wrath. The Savior had become the storm. And yet, even in destruction, the mystery deepened. Because through this chaos, God's plan was still unfolding. He used Samson's fury to fracture the enemy's control, but heaven wept as the chosen one began to drift further from his calling. For each victory won by strength, a piece of his spirit weakened. For every enemy he crushed, pride whispered louder, "See what you can do without him." The line between deliverance and destruction blurred. Samson, once a symbol of divine justice, now teetered on the edge of rebellion. He was God's chosen warrior, yet the war had moved inside his own heart. And while the world saw a hero, heaven saw a tragedy being written in real time. He stood upon the ashes of burning fields, the flames reflected in his eyes like the light of a false dawn. For the first time, the warrior felt hollow. His power roared, but his purpose whispered. And in the silence, another shadow stirred the beginning of a greater temptation, one that would reach not for his sword, but for his soul. The stage was set. The hunter had become the hunted. And in the flicker of those dying flames, the voice of destiny murmured again, soft but relentless, "Every divine gift comes with a cost." The fire of vengeance cooled into smoke. The hero of Israel walked deeper into the labyrinth of his desires, unaware that every step forward was leading him closer to the woman who would end him. There are enemies who strike with swords, and there are those who strike with a smile. The Philistines had learned what their armies could not, that Samson's weakness was not in his body, but in his heart. They sent no warriors this time, only a woman, Delilah. Her name would echo through eternity as both seduction and ruin. She entered Samson's life not with the sound of battle, but with the hush of a whisper. Her beauty was disarming, her eyes soft as twilight, her words smoother than honey dripping from the lion's carcass he once conquered. And yet beneath that sweetness lay the venom of betrayal. The Philistine lords promised her silver 30 pieces, the same price paid centuries later for another betrayal. All she needed was to find the secret of Samson's strength, that divine fire that made him unstoppable, unbreakable, untouchable. At first, Samson laughed at her questions. He teased, he jested, believing himself invincible. Each night, she asked, "Tell me the secret of your strength." Each night, he lied. "Bind me with new ropes," he said. "Braid my hair into 7 locks and weave it into a loom." Each time she tested him, and each time he broke free. The game became their ritual, a dangerous dance between love and deceit. But love, when corrupted by pride, blinds faster than any enemy's blade. Delilah's persistence became his lullaby, her touch a net spun from desire and deception. He mistook manipulation for affection, the same mistake humanity has made since Eden's garden. Night after night she whispered. Day after day she wore him down, until the man who had slain 1,000 with a donkey's jawbone could no longer resist the whisper of a single voice. Delilah leaned closer, her breath upon his ear. Tell me, Samson, if you love me, why do you hide from me? And in that fragile moment, the strongest man on earth became weaker than ever before. He sighed, exhausted, defeated by his own longing. My strength lies in my hair, he murmured, for I am consecrated to God from birth. If my head is shaved, I will be like any other man. A pause, the stillness before betrayal, the quiet before apocalypse. As he slept upon her lap, she called for the Philistines to come. The silver clinked in her hand as the scissors glinted in the firelight. One cut, then another, then silence. Each strand that fell was more than hair. It was covenant calling destiny itself. When Samson awoke, he reached for the strength that had always answered him, but the heavens were silent. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from him. The Philistines burst in chains, flashing in the torchlight. He fought, but the fire was gone. They bound him, struck him, and laughed. And in an act of cruelty that would haunt history, they gouged out his eyes. The world that once trembled before him vanished into darkness. He who once saw visions of angels and victory now saw nothing but endless night. The invincible warrior was led away a blind prisoner, grinding grain for his enemies, turning the same wheel day after day, a living monument to wasted power and divine sorrow. But somewhere deep within that darkness, something began to stir. The hair on his head, shorn by betrayal, began to grow again, and with it faith, small, fragile, but alive. For though the world had forgotten him, God had not. Samson's eyes were gone, but for the first time he began to see, not the world around him, but the truth within. He had been chosen not to destroy by anger, but to deliver by sacrifice. The shadow of Delilah had taken his sight, but it could not steal his destiny. And as the blind warrior turned the millstone under the laughter of his captors, a quiet fire began to rise again, a fire that would soon consume everything. Blind, broken, forgotten, the mighty warrior of Israel now moved in circles, endless, silent circles. The same man who once carried the gates of Gaza upon his shoulders now pushed the heavy millstone like an animal. The chains clinked with every step, each sound a cruel reminder of what he had lost: his freedom, his sight, his purpose. But what the world could not see was that in that dungeon something sacred was being reborn. Each rotation of the millstone was a prayer carved into time. Every insult hurled by his captors became a hymn of repentance whispered through clenched teeth. And slowly, within the darkness that had swallowed him, a faint light began to flicker. He remembered the angel's words, "He shall begin to deliver Israel." He remembered his mother's trembling voice, her prayers over his crib, her warnings that strength without obedience becomes destruction. He remembered, and he wept. The man who once mocked weakness now understood it. The man who once stood unshaken by armies was now undone by humility. But in that brokenness he found what he had lost, not his strength, but his God. "Lord," he whispered to the silence, "remember me. Strengthen me one last time." There was no thunder, no lightning, no sign from heaven, only silence. But in that silence, Samson felt it, a pulse, a presence, a quiet reassurance. God had not abandoned him. He had only been waiting for the warrior to become the servant, for the pride to bow before grace. The Philistines, meanwhile, celebrated their triumph. In their marble temples, they offered sacrifices to Dagon, their god of grain and war, boasting that he had conquered, the God of Israel. They did not know that the true battle was no longer on the battlefield. It was being fought inside the heart of a blind man grinding their grain. Each day, Samson's hair grew longer, a living symbol of covenant restored. But more than his hair, his spirit began to rise. He felt the breath of faith return to his chest. The same God who had called him from the womb was calling him again not to fight for glory, but to die for purpose. There is a mystery in the way heaven redeems a man. Sometimes the fall is not punishment, but preparation. The dungeon was Samson's wilderness, and in its darkness he found the voice of light. When his captors mocked him, he did not curse. When they laughed, he prayed. Each tear that fell into the dust became a seed of redemption. And like a seed buried beneath the earth, it began to grow unseen until the time of revelation. For months, the Philistines believed their victory was secure. They paraded their champion in festivals, mocking him as the defeated servant of a dead god. But their laughter was prophecy turned upside down, because their triumph was the sound of their own undoing. Heaven had begun to move again, and Samson could feel it deep within his bones like thunder buried under the surface of the earth, waiting to break free. He stood taller. The millstone turned slower. In his blindness, he saw more clearly than ever before. He saw that his life had never been about strength, but surrender. He saw that his purpose was not to live forever, but to finish what had begun in his mother's womb. The Philistines believed the God of Israel had fallen silent. But the silence of God is never absence. It is the gathering of power before the storm. And in the heart of that dungeon, as Samson lifted his scarred hands to the heavens, heaven listened. Light touched the darkness once more, and a plan older than kings and empires began to unfold, a plan that would shake the pillars of the earth. The spirit that once left him was returning, and with every heartbeat, redemption drew nearer. The stage was being set for one final act, not of wrath, but of glory, not of defeat, but of deliverance. The blind warrior smiled faintly as he turned the stone one last time. He could feel it, the call, the fire, the destiny awakening. What was lost would soon be restored. What was broken would soon be made whole. The temple of Dagon trembled with drunken laughter. From every corner of Gaza, the Philistines gathered to celebrate their victory over the God of Israel. The air reeked of incense and arrogance. Their priests raised their hands to heaven and shouted, "Dagon has delivered Samson into our hands." The music was wild, the chants relentless. And then through the crowd the doors opened and silence fell. Samson, the once mighty judge of Israel, entered the temple, blind, scarred, led by the hand of a child. The same man who had shaken nations was now paraded as a spectacle, a broken relic of a forgotten god. "Bring him out that we may laugh at him," the lords of the Philistines cried, and laughter, cruel, thunderous laughter, filled the halls. They mocked the man who once burned their fields, who had slain 1,000 of their warriors with the jawbone of a donkey. Now he could not even see the faces of those who ridiculed him. But Samson had not come to entertain them. He had come to fulfill his destiny. "Lead me," he whispered to the boy who guided him to the pillars that hold up the temple, "that I may rest upon them." The boy obeyed. Samson's trembling fingers brushed the cold stone. He felt the weight of the structure, the pulse of thousands gathered above and below. He lifted his head toward the unseen heavens and prayed, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Strengthen me one last time, that I may avenge the loss of my eyes." And in that moment the air changed. Heaven stirred. The same spirit that had once abandoned him returned not as thunder, but as fire beneath his skin. For the first time, Samson understood this was not vengeance, it was redemption. He drew a deep breath. His muscles tensed. His heart beat like war drums. He pressed his hands against the pillars and whispered, "Let me die with the Philistines." Cracks began to crawl along the stone. The ground trembled. Screams erupted as dust rained from the ceiling. Samson's arms shook, every vein straining every bone, crying out. And then the pillars gave way. The temple roared like a collapsing mountain. Stone and fire consumed everything, the rulers, the priests, the mockers, the slaves, and in the chaos, Samson's face turned upward, calm, almost radiant. The warrior who had once fought for glory was now dying for deliverance. When the dust settled, the great temple of Dagon was no more. Thousands of Philistines lay buried beneath its ruins. And there among them lay Samson, the man who in death accomplished more than he ever had in life. His people found his body and carried it to the tomb of Manoah, his father. The songs of mourning became songs of remembrance, for in that single act the God of Israel had turned defeat into victory, humiliation into honor, death into deliverance. Samson's story is not one of tragedy, but of transformation. He began in strength, fell in pride, and rose again in surrender. He discovered that divine power is not found in muscles or might, but in faith that refuses to die even when everything else is lost. And so the final breath of Samson became a timeless truth that even the broken can become instruments of glory, that redemption is stronger than ruin, and that no darkness, not even death, can silence the light of God's purpose. The dust of Gaza settled. The laughter of the Philistines faded into history. But the echo of that prayer, "Lord, remember me," still resounds across the centuries, reminding all who fall that even in our lowest moment, heaven still listens.